Hi folks, welcome back to Vasculature. I forget what this section is about. Oh, this is about regulation. Good. So this is about regulating blood flow and regulating blood pressures. As you're going to see very shortly that keeping an adequate blood pressure is essential to homeostasis, health and well-being. So let's just start with, first of all, let me define a word for you. Perfusion is probably the most important thing with getting oxygen and nutrients to your tissues. Uh, you could have just a perfectly fine arterial saturation, be 99% saturated. But if your blood is not getting to the capillary beds, then you have low perfusion. You're not delivering the oxygen and nutrients to the tissues. So we have to have proper perfusion to get the oxygen and nutrients to the tissues. And after you do have proper perfusion, of course, then you need your blood to be, your arterial blood to be saturated with oxygen and picking up nutrients from the intestines and things like this. But you have to get the blood there to begin with, so you need perfusion. We have two types of regulation. We have auto-regulation and central regulation. And the first thing that's being shown here is central regulation, and that involves the central nervous system. That means the brain and spinal cord. So central regulation, first of all, what happens? If your blood pressure is too low, and that means your or your perfusion is inadequate, well, what's going to happen is waste products are going to build up, waste products like acids and CO2, all right? And uh, this is going to trigger a response to increase blood pressure and to maybe vasodilate and increase perfusion. So relax those capillary sphincters and allow the blood to get through those capillary beds, vasodilate those arterioles to reduce the peripheral resistance, to increase flow to that area. And meanwhile, back at the heart level, increase heart rate, increase cardiac output, increase stroke volume, increase blood pressure at the heart level. So all of this stuff can happen to push blood to the area where there's low perfusion. So if I have low perfusion, I am going to short-term elevation of blood pressure from the sympathetic nervous system. All right. And I'm going to, and by the way, well, I'll talk about that in a second. And I'm going to increase blood volume and increase blood pressure on a long-term basis as well. And it has to do with the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. So I think we've already talked about, no, I don't think we did. I don't remember if we have talked about this. But if we didn't, we're about to. The renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. So we're going to do that. Let me go back and explain something. Something's going to become very apparently confusing in a few minutes here. To increase blood pressure, you have to vasoconstrict. But to increase blood flow, you have to vasodilate. So how do I know which one to do when? Well, if you have your heart and you have your big arteries, which are becoming smaller and smaller arteries, and I'll just branch one more time. What happens is you can vasoconstrict all the way out through here and increase pressure. But then what can happen is in your arterioles, your smaller arterioles, you can vasodilate these guys. And what these guys do, if they vasodilate, then there's less resistance to flow. And the blood under high pressure down through here will rush right in here because you opened it up and allowed the blood to rush right in. So you can have an overall systemic vasoconstriction all through here. But you could have a local vasodilation that increases the flow in that one area. This could be relaxing precapillary sphincters and allowing the blood to flow through that capillary bed. This could be the smooth muscles of particular arterioles. So yes, you do have to have a systemic vasoconstriction to increase blood pressure. But that doesn't mean you can't have a local vasodilation to increase blood flow. Okay. So that's increasing perfusion. This is an auto-regulation. It's a very local regulation. And what happens is local changes, like decreased oxygen or decreased pH, which is acidic, or increased CO2 or some chemicals. You could have some chemicals that are causing this. These local conditions right here tell cells in the area that you have low perfusion. Inadequate local blood flow is low perfusion. All right. Well, what happens? Well, what happens? These local cells secrete vasodilators. And the vasodilators cause local vasodilation, which decreases resistance and leads to an increase of flow. Remember, flow and resistance are inversely proportional. And then this restores perfusion to the area, and with restored perfusion, you bring more oxygen in and you fix this problem. You get rid of the acids and you fix the pH problem. The CO2 enters the blood and is carried away back to the heart and the lungs. You breathe it out, you get rid of that problem. And you can see that this local autoregulation increases blood flow to the area, and you fix the problem that you have, which is low CO2, low oxygen, high CO2, low pH, and you fix that problem. So who does what when? Like, when do you have central regulation and when do you have autoregulation? And the answer is you do them both at the same time. But you would actually only have to bring in the central regulation if autoregulation is inadequate. That's why it says if autoregulation is ineffective, then I will do central regulation and endocrine mechanisms. That's when I would do that. Because if autoregulation is effective, then you'll never have to bring the central nervous system into it. Now, remember when I told you that less than half of the capillary beds are open at any given time? Well, how do we know, or what dictates when one capillary bed's open and another one is closed, and when they flip-flop in vasomotion? Remember, that's called vasomotion. Well, what happens is local regulation, autoregulation controls that. The capillary bed is closed until CO2 goes up and oxygen goes down and pH goes down. And then you open those precapillary sphincters, and then blood flow to that capillary bed increases. Whereas in another capillary bed where oxygen is high, CO2 is low, and you have a normal pH, you would close those capillary sphincters, contract them, and close down that capillary bed. So it's all autoregulation, unless autoregulation can't keep up, and then you use central regulation.
Increased blood pressure stretches the carotid arteries and aorta, causing the baroreceptors to increase their basal rate of action potential generation. Action potentials are conducted by the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves to the cardioregulatory and vasomotor centers in the medulla oblongata. As a result of increased stimulation from the baroreceptors, the cardioregulatory center increases parasympathetic stimulation to the heart, which decreases the heart rate. Also, as a result of the increased stimulation from the baroreceptors, the cardiovascular center decreases sympathetic stimulation to the heart, which decreases heart rate and stroke volume. The vasomotor center decreases sympathetic stimulation to blood vessels, causing vasodilation. The vasodilation, along with the decreased heart rate and decreased stroke volume, bring the elevated blood pressure back toward normal. If the initial problem were a decrease in blood pressure, the activities and effects of the baroreceptors, cardiovascular center, and vasomotor center would be the opposite of what is illustrated.
So there's a control mechanism right there initiated by baroreceptors in my aortic and carotid sinuses, and they help control the blood pressure. So if the blood pressure is too high, they'll respond, they'll go through the cardiac center of the medulla oblongata and they'll lower blood pressure, and if it's too low, they'll send signals to the medulla oblongata, which will result in raising blood pressure. So that's definitely a central control mechanism because you're involving the brain. This is a still picture showing you exactly what the video showed you. And I'll just say it again, if the blood pressure is too high, information is carried by the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve. It tells the brain, hey, blood pressure is too high. The brain responds by saying, slow down the heart rate and vasodilate the blood vessels, and that lowers blood pressure. Whereas if the blood pressure is too low, the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerve tell the brain the blood pressure is too low, and the brain sends out signals saying, okay, let's speed up the heart rate, let's vasoconstrict the blood vessels. And that's a central nervous system control because you're involving the brain there. This is another homeostatic mechanism that is talking about the same thing we just said. You start out with normal blood pressure, but for some reason it goes up. See, increased blood pressure. Baroreceptors detect it. Cardioinhibitory center is stimulated. That means you're going to slow down your heart. Cardioacceleratory center is inhibited. That means you're not going to speed up your heart. See, I mean, you're going to say slow down your heart, and you're also going to say don't speed up my heart. There are actually two different pathways, even though they result in the same thing, which is slowing down the heart. And your vasomotor center is inhibited, which means the sympathetic nervous system doesn't cause vasoconstriction, which leads to vasodilation, and overall this lowers blood pressure. Likewise, you could have a problem with homeostasis where your blood pressure is too low. Your baroreceptors don't fire with the same frequency. In other words, they're sending an inhibitory signal to the brain. The frequency that the baseline frequency they usually fire at is slower. Now they're sending an inhibitory signal to the brain. The vasomotor center is stimulated, which means the sympathetic nerves cause vasoconstriction, which raises blood pressure. The cardioacceleratory center is stimulated, which means you increase your heart rate. The cardioinhibitory center is inhibited, which means you don't decrease your heart rate. Overall, that increases your heart rate and cardiac output, and you restore blood pressure. So both of those occur to maintain proper blood pressure and perfusion.
Chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic bodies monitor blood oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH. Impulses from these chemoreceptors are conducted to the control centers for heart and blood vessels via the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves. Chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata monitor blood carbon dioxide and pH. Decreased blood oxygen, increased carbon dioxide, or decreased pH decrease parasympathetic stimulation of the heart, which increases the heart rate. Decreased blood oxygen, increased carbon dioxide, and decreased pH increase sympathetic stimulation of the heart, which increases heart rate and stroke volume. Increased sympathetic stimulation of blood vessels increases vasoconstriction.
All right, folks, now let me just remind you, you've seen this video before in a previous chapter. You might be saying, why the heck do I want to increase heart rate when my pH is low and my CO2 is high and my oxygen is low? And the answer is you have to synchronize blood flow and breathing. Because if your CO2 is high, you're going to breathe faster. But there's absolutely no sense in breathing faster if you don't pump more blood to the lungs. There's no sense in it because the blood carries the CO2 that your breathing wants to get rid of. And you're breathing faster and bringing more oxygen into your body, but it has to have some place to go, and your blood carries it. So if you're not going to send more blood to the lungs, you might as well not breathe faster. So what this really is, this chemoreceptor reflex of heart control, is really just synchronizing breathing and blood flow. That's really what it's doing. And this is a still picture showing you that. And basically, high CO2 makes your heart beat faster, low pH makes your heart beat faster, and low oxygen makes your heart beat faster. And it's just to deliver more blood to your lungs to fix those problems. And this is not a different picture, but this does show you how the respiratory response is synchronized to the cardiovascular response. See, if I'm going to increase cardiac output and blood pressure, that's because I'm increasing respiratory rate. I must synchronize these to get rid of the high CO2 and to fix the low O2 and to raise the low pH. And by the way, CO2 and pH are intimately related, and it's coming up in the respiratory chapter, but I might as well tell you right now. This is why breathing out CO2 will actually raise my pH anyway, because this happens. And if you remember your chemistry, if I increase CO2, I drive the reaction to the right. If I decrease CO2, let me get rid of my arrow. If I decrease CO2, I pull the reaction to the left. It's called Le Chatelier's principle, law of mass action. Likewise, if I increase pH, I drive the reaction to the left. If I decrease pH, I pull the reaction to the right. So if I breathe out CO2 and I lower CO2, I pull this reaction to the left, and that lowers my protons, my hydrogens, my acids. This is an acid. It lowers my acids. It raises my pH by lowering my hydrogen. Remember, low pH is high hydrogen because it's acidic. High pH is low hydrogen because it's basic. So this whole equation right here explains how breathing affects pH. And likewise, this is when the other thing occurs, but this I have to spend some time on because I have to tell you about the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Now, that's the long-term effect, so let's talk about short-term first and get it out of the way. If my blood pressure is decreased, it could be for any reason. One reason could be volume decrease. I'm going to have a sympathetic activation and an adrenal medullary stimulation. Basically, I'm going to have epinephrine and norepinephrine. That's adrenaline and noradrenaline released. This increases vasoconstriction, which increases blood pressure, and this increases cardiac output, which increases blood pressure. That's what this does. My blood pressure increases. Meanwhile, my long-term effect goes like this. My kidneys detect the low blood pressure and they secrete renin. What renin does, I'm looking for a place to put it. Renin converts angiotensinogen. Let me erase that. Let me start again. Renin converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Renin does that. Now, angiotensin 1 has a mild vasoconstrictive effect, but it's pretty weak. So I'm not even gonna, we might as well just ignore that effect because it's actually a very weak effect. But angiotensin 1 encounters an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme. Angiotensin converting enzyme. And that converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. Now, angiotensin 2 has several effects. All right. One effect that angiotensin 2 has is it tells the hypothalamus to increase ADH. Now, antidiuretic hormone, ADH, goes to my kidneys, and it says increase water reabsorption. So it increases water in my body, which increases blood volume. All right. Angiotensin 2 also goes to my adrenal cortex, and it says increase aldosterone. Aldosterone goes to my kidneys and says reabsorb more sodium. Now, by reabsorbing more sodium, I actually indirectly reabsorb more water because water follows salt. Water always travels from a hypotonic environment into a hypertonic environment. And my blood is now hypertonic because I just reabsorbed a bunch of sodium into it. So now the water is going to leave my renal filtrate, my urine, and it's going to enter my blood. Water is going to leave my filtrate and enter my blood because my blood is salty. And that increases blood volume, and that increases blood pressure. Angiotensin 2 also makes me thirsty, which makes me drink, which gives me the water to absorb in my kidneys. And all of this increases blood volume and blood pressure. In addition, my kidneys respond to a low blood pressure by increasing a hormone called erythropoietin. Erythropoietin goes to my bone marrow, and it says make more red blood cells. This is called erythropoiesis, as you know, because we had it in a previous chapter. This erythropoiesis is production of red blood cells, which increases blood volume and increases blood pressure. Now let me tell you something about this renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. You're going to have it in Bio 252. You're going to have it in a nursing program and in a PA program and in medical school, and I'm sure you're going to have it at a pharmacy school if you're going to be a pharmacist. For example, there's drugs that are ACE inhibitors. They knock out ACE. What's their result? Lower blood pressure. So you're going to have this no matter which allied health field you're going into. Please master this renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. That's what it's called. It's called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. We abbreviate that RAAS. And you can ask in lab, just ask Ryan. I was trying to think who took Bio 252 before they took Bio 251. Ryan definitely did. There's a couple others. It's just not coming to my mind. Ask Ryan. He'll tell you that we hit this hard in Bio 252. You need to know it for both courses. You need to know it for future allied health programs as well. I can tell you that nursing students even right this semester have come to my office and said, please explain to me acid-base balance again, because they're doing that right now. And then they've come to my office most recently and they said, please explain to me that renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system again. You're going to get to the nursing program and the nurses are expecting you to know this. And they're not going to reteach it to you in the fine detail that we're doing here. They're just going to want you to know the outcome. So please master it. I'm imploring that you master this because I'm going to test you on it, and plus nursing faculty are going to test you on it. Now, we do have an opposing effect to the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, and it works like this. It's called the natriuretic peptides. We have two types of atrial uretic peptides. We have atrial natriuretic, this word right here, natriuretic, and we have brain natriuretic peptides. These are the two types. Atrial come from the atria, and brain comes from the ventricles. I know you're going to say it comes from the brain. Well, it was discovered in the brain, but BNP, it is made in the brain, and it was discovered in the brain, but BNP is made by the ventricles. What happens is, if the blood pressure is too high and my atria and ventricles are stretched too much, then they make these atrial and brain natriuretic peptides. They make these two right here. By the way, some people call them factors, ANF and BNF. It's the same thing. Atrial natriuretic factors and brain natriuretic factors are the same as AMP and BNP. So I make AMP and BNP, and what does that do for me? Well, it inhibits aldosterone. So I have low aldosterone. Therefore, I don't reabsorb sodium. So I have increased sodium loss in the urine. Therefore, I don't reabsorb water. I keep less water in my body. I increase my water loss in my urine. It inhibits thirst. Remember how angiotensin 2 improves increased thirst? AMP and BNP decrease thirst. I don't drink. I inhibit ADH. Remember how angiotensin 2 cause the secretion of ADH? Well, AMP and BNP lower the secretion of ADH. They lower the secretion of aldosterone. Therefore, I don't reabsorb sodium and I don't reabsorb water. They inhibit epinephrine and norepinephrine. Therefore, I don't vasoconstrict. I vasodilate. All of this decreases blood volume and decreases blood pressure. And it was all begun because of an increase of blood pressure, so I fixed the problem. So really what I have is a renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system and an atrial natriuretic peptide system that oppose each other. That's really what I have here. And there's the collage showing you the two. Please master that. And that's it. See you next section.